Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Common Sanity, episode 2/3, depending on which format and platform you've been following it on. I am joined now by Mark Billingham and Lucy Mangan to discuss the lies which are at the heart of fiction. And they may not have realized it was going to be quite that aggressively put. But perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself, folks. Mark, why don't you go first? You seem to be on my screen at the moment.
I am Mark Billingham, and I'm just thoroughly enjoying this delicious lamb shank.
It is amazing, isn't it? You can see how it works, the whole theme of the conversation.
Absolutely. And I am a crime writer. I write crime fiction. I guess.
Is that your crime fiction behind you in sort of aquamarine and turquoise and dark blue?
What, that?
There's a whole shelf up there, which I assume you're either a fanatic about somebody else's.
There's a lot of crime fiction. There's a lot of classic crime fiction up there. The kind of, there's what can I see? I can see G.K. Chesterton and Ross MacDonald and Ross Thomas and James M. Cain and
fantastic. That is a good collection. So you've written what, something over 15, 20 books now?
I've just delivered book 22.
22, yeah. Fantastic. That is quite an achievement. Lucy, how many books do you have to your name?
I have about probably 10,000, but they're not behind me.
And how many books have you written?
Well, I've written, that kind of thing. 5 or 6, depending if you count fiction columns and that kind of thing. Then
well, that's not bad. No columns count. Definitely. I think my favourite books are usually compiled columns. Actually, to be honest, reading somebody's extended thoughts can often be rather tiresome, can't it? It's quite an imposition on your time.
Yeah. Leave them wanting more.
That's tremendous. I think you're best known for your sort of memoir of being a childhood bookworm. Would that be true? Or, I mean, as well as your columnist work, of course.
Well, that's the only one that's brought me in any money. So, yeah, going.
Yeah. Well, that's something we might come on to, is the extraordinary Pareto distribution of authorial earnings, which I think it puts even OnlyFans porno accounts into the shade, doesn't it, in terms of unequal distribution?
I made nothing from that. That's a real...
How have you gone on the OnlyFans, Mark?
I don't even know what that is.
Do you not? Oh, it's sort of like it's a sort of bespoke undressing service. Basically, you get, instead of just watching off the shelf porn, you have a direct relationship with usually a young lady, although I'm sure there are gentlemen.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and it's called OnlyFans, and it's it has two principal sort of sources of notoriety. One, that some people have become multimillionaires really quite quickly. And secondly, that the vast majority of wannabes have struggled to even pay rent, offering quite sort of humiliating and debasing services.
Well, it's like people that will do the ironing naked or something like that.
Oh, I don't know if they do the ironing, but I think the idea is that they undress and that they model for you, and then I don't know whether it happens live. I know you can do this now with sort of Patreon-based live streams on YouTube. Some friends of mine are doing this, and people will pay £5 just to get their question read out and then answered. So it might be a bit like that, but I think it's more like a one-on-one. It's like a kind of lap dance, but through a screen. But it's basically a lockdown lap dance. That would have been a better.
Well, it would need to be live. I mean, it wouldn't really be much of a service if you said, take your shoes off, and you got a message saying, I'll be doing that tomorrow at 3:00. Tune in again.
Some of them are it's probably a little bit like, do you know Peloton, the bicycle sort of thing? Right. So we have one of those. Kate managed to con me into that by fiddling the figures. And you think you're doing that live, and it has like a leaderboard on the side and everything. And in fact, if you read into the small print, it's not live, and the algorithms are making it feel live, and you're racing against other people who have raced at previous times, but you're being smoked, and then you gradually realize that you are a second-class citizen, in fact. But if you want to log on at a particular time, you can experience it. Anyway, none of these things so far either of you have had to resort to in order to make a living with your books. So, Lucy, the other thing, and this is less than as an author, I thought it would be interesting to have your take on this subject, because you review mainly television, is that right? I'm thinking, for The Garden, that's mainly what I see you doing.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing that for?
For that exclusively, now as a sort of their TV critic, 2 years, I think.
So you've seen a lot, and would you say that was mostly drama, or do you do documentaries and that sort of thing as well?
No, we dot around. I've basically seen the first episode of a lot of dramas.
Yeah.
and complete documentaries for the last.
That's essentially all I ever watch. You're my ideal TV critic.
Yeah.
My wife and I like to watch box sets, and usually what happened, you know, as everyone does now, and we all sit down and we watch the first two or three maybe episodes of something, and then as it used to be with my job, I'd go out gigging the next few nights, and when I'd get around to settling down with her again the next time, she'd be on season 3, episode 14, and I'm not really willing to fill it in. Anyway, that's all gone now, obviously, and lockdown has been the great leveler from that point of view. But so here is my big theme. Okay, this is what I want to ask you both from your two different perspectives. How much of our worldview as children and as adults and as we evolve is informed or even formed by the fiction we consume, whether it be on the page or on the screen? And to what extent do people who create fiction have a responsibility to bear that in mind? And does it distort society? Do we have a distorted idea of how things really are? Because drama is, and even comedy is, so much more gripping usually, and kind of it's like intravenous by comparison with documentaries and the news. You know, if you get locked into a good book or something, it really captures you and inhabits you. And is this an issue that we need to think about, worry about? I am positing that I think it might be, but not worry ourselves into an early grave, but worth of an hour's discussion at any rate. Lucy, kick it off. What do you think? How do you take that?
I think it's got to be true, hasn't it? We're all formed by everything we consume. I did write a bit in Bookworm that kind of almost caught me by surprise when I said I've gone through life experiencing emotions and situations only after I've read about them several times. So I recognize them from books rather than having a sort of, I've never had an unmediated experience in my life. You know, I fall in love and I go, oh, this is just like, yes, page. It's so I think the older you get, actually, the more you become aware of how much you've been shaped and where it's come from, and you realize, you're just a puppet. The world's puppet, and it's quite depressing, really.
It's powerful, isn't it? It's a powerful, and I think equally an opposite. As you get older, sometimes you read what are supposed to be absolutely sort of formative texts. For instance, for the first time ever, about 3 months ago, I read Anna Karenina, which is supposed to be one of the great sort of depictions of forbidden love and divorce and the torment and so on, and ends in this great. And it just didn't touch me at all. I mean, I was just, I don't know whether I just left it too late. It's not normally spoken of in the same breath as Catcher in the Rye. I don't know what age would be ideal, but I'd reached a point where I just formed my own ideas about divorce and adultery and so on, and probably even about sort of high Moscow society in the mid 19th century. And
that's quite a temperamental issue as well, because you're a sort of, we've never met, so I don't, but I've read you on Twitter. You're sort of a natural contrarian as well, so you're always going to come to these.
You read me very well.
You're always going to come to these classics.
Well, some of them I loved. I mean, I've taken the time under lockdown to read a few classics, and actually Audible has been my friend in this regard, because I do find the actual physical act of reading now quite soporific. But having it just playing through my ears the whole day long, I feel like I zone in and out a little bit, but it goes in. And some of them I thought were fantastic. Moby Dick and War and Peace and Jane Eyre, in fact, probably one of my absolute favorites. But I don't know. Divorce didn't seem to me. I don't know. That's changed, I guess. Mark, what about you? How do you recognise that from childhood? And
yes, I do. But I mean, of course, the elephant in the room here is that if our lives are formed by the fiction we read, it only applies to very few of us, because I'm constantly amazed by how many people don't read. Or read very, very little. It's that thing of, what are you reading that book for?
The old Bill Hicks, looks like we got us a reader. Yeah,
exactly that.
I actually looked it up on Google a few days ago to sort of prepare for this to some extent. How many books do people read per year? And the average in America, where the figures are more readily available, the average was a little bit higher than I was fearing. It was sort of around a dozen. But that is apparently skewed by a handful of people who just read a huge amount and always answer these surveys. The headline was, most Americans read a book last year. a book, yeah. And even then, there was no indication of whether it was one that might stretch them or sort of leave a proper scar.
No, it was probably the same book. I mean, this is what happens an awful lot when a book becomes the book you have to read.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in popular fiction terms here, because it's only ever the case in popular fiction, really. There aren't too many people going, oh, I really need to read that David Foster Wallace, or I must read that book I see everybody else reading on the tube. And so they all go out and buy whatever it might be.
And publishing world has realized quite recently, I don't know how you feel about this, Lucy, because this wouldn't have been the case when you were a bookworm, and that was you were probably absorbing some of the classics. But the publishing world has recognized the young adult market, and indeed probably just the straightforward teen market now, as among the most lucrative that there are. And consequently, I mean, if there was the phrase "read another fucking book" was like a popular, almost an acronym on Twitter as a response to anyone who was using Harry Potter as a prism, through which to understand modern current events. This kind of, I don't know whether Rowling did that or whether she just surfed that wave, But I mean, when you were reading as a young bookworm, Lucy, what kind of books did you read?
Well, I mean, you're right. In that, I was thinking as I wrote it, someone remembering their reading in 30 years' time won't be able to connect as much as I seem to with certain readers, because I was writing about really quite a small canon, because the explosion hadn't happened yet. You had your classics, you had the
nice use of canon and explosion there. Very good.
Thank you. It hadn't happened yet, so you had just the Edwardian golden age classics, plus the few modern ones coming through, the 80s kind of problem novels, and that was really it. And then you went on to Jane Eyre and Woodhouse if you got a bit older.
And, I mean, almost everything I read until I was at least 14 or 15, I think, seemed to be at least Edwardian, and actually pretty much at most. In fact, it was from quite a narrow band, I would say, roughly 1900 to the First World War. That seemed to be it.
Children's literature as a real thing doesn't even start till about 1865 with Alice in Wonderland. So it's a really short period you're dealing with.
I mean, so much of this depends, I think, in whether you grew up in a house full of books, or a house indeed in which there were any books. I mean, I didn't particularly. My mum was a reader, but a reader of popular fiction. I remember seeing a copy of Valley of the Dolls next to my mum's bed and thinking,
racy.
No, exactly that, because they had some pills on the cover. So she would read those things, and then it was lots, Nora Lofts and Jean Plaidy and those kind of romance books, But for me, there's nothing between the books you have to read at school, the books you're given at school, and some of them very good books, having to sit and read 1984 or Animal Farm or To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever it might be. And those sort of books you're talking about, Tom's Midnight Garden and all that sort of stuff. And then suddenly it was Jaws and The Godfather.
Yeah.
For me, there seems to be nothing in the middle. But the crucial thing was, those were the books I'd gone out and found for myself. Yeah. Almost certainly shoplifted from W.H.
Well, I got mine from jumble sales, very much like Lucy, like the one that Lucy runs. But I used to be in the Scouts, and we'd have a jumble sale 2 or 3 times a year, and that I would always come back with an adult novel. I do remember my copy of The Godfather, of Jaws, of The Omen, and the Exorcist.
Yeah, and the Rat by James Herbert.
Yeah, fantastic. And you're right, I can't remember I think there might have been 2 Sven Hassels. About tank commanders or something, and then
I'm not sure any of those books told me anything about the world.
No,
I mean, but what they did do was provoke a reaction in me that I didn't know a book could do that. Because and I think the key thing is that it's your own book. It's not a book you're having to read because you've got to write an essay on it. It's not something that's been prescribed. It's something you've gone out and bought, and it's your secret thing. And it helps when you're 13 and a book's got dirty bits in, like The Godfather did, and Jaws, in fact.
You remember the single page of dirtiness in Jaws in the restaurant?
Right. That's right. That's right. And
she's afraid when she gets up, she'll leave a mark.
Yeah, and obviously the the wedding scene in The Godfather. But that's the first time I went, I didn't know books could do this.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, the visceral kind of descriptions in Jaws and stuff, and the violence in The Godfather, literally knocking me back in my chair, going, I didn't know a book could do that.
And I don't know if it would be, but sorry, go on, Lucy. Yeah.
But did they not teach you something about how people, adults in that case, just relate to each other? Did they not teach you about emotions and how people can, you know, inflect, cause inflections in life?
Those kind of big American blockbusters.
And I know they're blockbusters, but
yeah. No, I'm not saying that pejoratively, but I remember Jackie Collins, who I used to read with, like, that was the guiltiest pleasure, because it was one thing to read male, like, blockbuster novelists, but to read a female one, that really is scandalous. But God, I love them. I would roar through those, and Gilly Cooper in a day, but she was a bit different, Gilly Cooper. That was very tongue-in-cheek and sort of Labradors and stuff. But Jackie Collins was acutely aware of, at least, and this is the thing, I think is almost like worth a Steven Pinker kind of, you know, are we hardwired to accept a certain vision of the world through novels kind of theory. Human dynamics, power dynamics, how people operate. And in reality, of course, I think very few of us ever live in such a heightened state as you experience when you follow the saga of the little orphan boy who grows up in the back streets of Naples and goes on to run a publishing empire in New York City or whatever. But you do, she is absolutely as interested in all of that as Shakespeare was.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true. But I think the book, you know, we are pre-programmed, I think, to receive certain things from books, dependent, almost literally, on the way that book is packaged. Yeah. Because if, you know, I mean, inevitably, I think we're going to have to talk about the genre fiction versus literary fiction, because you know, we are taught that which is why this. I mean, I'm going to get on a high horse quite soon into the discussion, I think. But the fact that people will plough through a literary novel that they are not enjoying. I mean, absolutely. Well, you know.
Guess which one?
Yeah, well, there's a list of them. But I mean, in a way that I don't think they would do with a science fiction novel or a romance or a crime novel or, you know, whatever it might be, because they are thinking, what's wrong with me? This book has just been reviewed to the heavens in all the big newspapers, and it must be wonderful, and to be shortlisted for X number of prizes. There's something wrong with me that I'm actually finding this unutterably tedious.
And also the feeling that it must be doing you good.
Yes, well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's that Victorian idea that reading
vegetables.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a little story about. I was on a radio show where you had to review books live with the authors there in the studio. It was a show they used to do on 5 Live, and I'd had a couple of books reviewed on there, and then they said, "Why don't you come back and review some?" So I went on, and the 2 books I had to review this one particular week were a book called The Lincoln Lawyer by a brilliant crime writer called Michael Connolly, wonderful American crime writer, and The Sea by John Banville, which had just won the Booker Prize. And so we're all reviewing these books, and John Banville and Michael Connolly are joining in with this discussion. Right? And I love the Michael Connolly, but it's great A to Z mystery writing. It's just fantastic. The Sea I could not get on with. I'm sorry, I just could not get on with it. Because in terms of a plot as such, you could write that on the back of a bus ticket. There isn't really a plot. It's all about the lush, sensuous prose. And the only way to read this book and enjoy it is to surrender yourself to the lush and sensuous prose. But every time I tried to do that, every couple of pages, I would come across a word I simply had never seen before. A word I'd never come across, never. And I'm filling a notebook with these words, and it's annoying me because I'm starting to feel stupid. And when I confronted Mr. Banville with this and said, are you trying to alienate readers? I mean, what is the point of filling your prose with these bizarre words? And he went, it's perfectly possible to read a book with a dictionary by its side, which is just about the most patronizing and ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It plays right into that idea that by the time you close a book, you should be improved somehow.
I know that there was the fantastic Hancock half hour on that theme, isn't there? I can't remember which one it is. He buys a difficult book. I can't remember people are shouting at this podcast all over the country now watching it, but because it is a classic episode. But he does that, and then he finally gives up, and he reverts to something simpler. And then on the very first page, he still has to look at the dictionary. It's funny that you say that, because I was reading a book. I've got it right here. This is genuinely one of my favorite books. This is Cultural Amnesia, which is a collection of short essays by Clive James, which are based on the marginalia, as he would call them, which I believe he is one of the few people who would genuinely have accumulated in, by the half ton over his reading lifetime. Essentially, when he reads a good book, he jots down notes and thinks about it. There is a bit of a theme to it, which is that, and it's a lifelong thing for him, which is the permanent sort of wariness of any drift into political extremism. It's like a defense of the center over a lifetime's reading. So there's a lot of dissident writing from Russia and Central Europe and that sort of thing as well, and from under Nazi occupation and that sort of stuff. So that's obviously quite heavyweight. But he also talks during it about how when you read Proust, after your first 2 or 3 times you've read it in your native language, it's time to have a go at reading it in the original. And it really isn't that difficult if you've got a Larousse encyclopedia and a friend. I just cannot imagine the speed at which I would make my way through the world's longest novel, even in English, let alone, you know what I mean? Some people just seem to have this volcanic appetite for breaking themselves on the rocks of culture like this. It's a different species.
The thing is about Clive James, he's the real deal. And it's that next lot down that sort of Mark's really talking about, that that kind of intellect, and that's what they think they should be doing, that's what they want to be, and that's instead of just going, God Christ, I'm not that clever, I'm no bloody genius, let me enjoy the stuff I enjoy.
It's that thing that I hear referred to in literary circles as the elegant variation. Where you cannot use the same word twice, even if it's the right word to use, you have to find another, So 2 people are talking and one will say, oh, I've just taken my car to the garage. And 2 sentences later, the other one will say, well, why did you take your car to the garage? Oh, no, I can't say car again. What's wrong with your vehicle? Well, and it's not ridiculous. It's not how people speak. It's
newspaper talk as well, isn't it? One of the aspects of reading largely Edwardian fiction as a child was it had zero bearing on the life I had. And it wasn't just like, there were pictures of Christopher Robin walking down the street, I guess it was supposed to be, some past Nash Villas or whatever, careful not to tread on the cracks in the pavement, and there were bears, I mean, it might as well have been science fiction, really, for all it had any kind of resemblance. And I understood, making make believe that your toys are real. That part was fine. And there is a kind of Tao of poo. I think that is a reasonable proposition. There was some sort of eternal wisdom, but it was as soon as any element of reality impinged on it, it was absurd. And I came back to that recently because I've been kind of temperamentally and dispositionally grinding my teeth over the notion of decolonizing the curriculum. As I feel my instinct is to defend the Western canon and the great sort of Victorian novels and so on. And then I think, is that healthy? Actually, do they have anything to say really about the life we live in now? It's not so much that it's a racist or white supremacist outlook. It's just that things have changed dramatically, and it's a bit of a counsel of despair not to believe that we can produce work as good now that actually reflects real life. And I wonder whether our still cleaving as a nation, certainly as an education system, to a certain period in fiction is healthy. Lucy.
I'm moving on to my delicious tiramisu.
Yeah, you get stuck in, Mark. You won't be able to stop talking in 5 minutes once that sugar hits the glue.
Well, there's about a million different things there. Let me think. I think we've all got, if we're all a certain age and colour and all the rest of it and class, we all have a certain instinct to defend what we've been brought up to believe is the best and the eternal and the good. Classic novels, and I think that impulse is good in that that's the one that stops a society ever throwing the baby out with the bathwater. These books are good, they do hold eternal truths, they do have this, that and the other going for them. The problem is that they were published is that you have to recognize, or start to recognize, that they were published and they survived because of a load of continuing prejudices, and that a lot of equally good stuff either would never have made it to print or will have died a death since then. There's a whole, and you have to sort of remember that and realize that and teach that. I think that's very fair to sort of teach that.
It is, and teach people to be able to distinguish for themselves and discern superior product when they see it.
Yeah, but also know that some superior products didn't ever see the light of day because of other factors, and that just because something has survived doesn't automatically mean it was always and always will be the best.
I'll give you a really good example of that, and I don't know what the final moral is, but Shelley's poem Ozymandias, very famous. I think most kids encounter it at school if they don't learn it by heart, and it's regarded as a classic, and it makes us think about all kinds of issues concerning sort of mortality and vainglorious, pursuit of wealth and status, and it all ends in dust and so on. It's seen as an absolutely iconic poem, an extraordinary insight, like a lightning bolt from Shelley's mind. It was actually composed in response to a competition. And there were a number. Here is a picture of this toppled statue of Ramses II, I think it is, and let's hear your thoughts on it, sort of thing, in the Spectator or something in 1870 or whatever it was. And I've seen a number of the other entries, and would I myself be able to distinguish that Shelley's was the best? I'm not at all sure I would. At least 2 or 3 others pursued very similar themes. Arguably, Shelley has a couple of really iconic lines, the lone and level sands and all that, but it's kind of, they're all on the same theme. They've all identified what this statue teaches us about the vanity of humanity. Yeah. And so, it just sort of supports your point really on that fact that it is hard to know, and it's probably worth teaching people to understand what it might be that has created the sort of legendary status these things achieve. But funnily enough, a part of this topic came to me when I was listening to Jane Eyre and thinking the most famous part of Jane Eyre is Mr. Rochester, of course, and the mad woman in the tower, and that's kind of problematic now, and books have been written about the whole story from her point of view. But the earlier section I found actually slightly more compelling, where she's in a terrible sort of oppressive orphanage stroke school, like a very Dickensian institution. And it just occurred to me that my entire understanding and appreciation and sort of image of how children were treated in the Victorian era comes from reading novels written by campaigning novelists of a more than usually liberal disposition who feel that terrible and unwarranted cruelty is being meted out to children in these places. I have no fundamental understanding of what the system really looked like, or who funded it, or how children ended up there, or what most of their experiences were, or what the alternative was, or any of the rest of it. Do you know what I mean? It all comes from that. And I think it's interesting in that regard, because very possibly at that time, she was drawing attention to what would have been regarded as an outlier, a school that was failing to meet the standard society had presumed it would, and was not bothering to inspect it. But it might very easily have been quite a rare occurrence. You know what I'm getting at here? There's a tendency for fiction to outlast news, and very few people to actually read history, and consequently fiction is what remains of the past to a greater extent than any other version of it.
Yes, I certainly think there's a lot in that. I think it is it's not compulsory, but I think there should be a responsibility that fiction writers should have a degree of responsibility to reflect the world they're writing, that they're living in as they're writing. And I think there was a time when that was specifically the job of literary fiction with a capital L. And certainly in terms of my lifetime, in the 60s and the 70s, I think it did that. I think it was doing that. I'd like to know where those writers are now. Because since then, it's been very easy to dismiss literary fiction and put it into, the bloody Hampstead dinner party novel and the coming of age novel. And, it's not really saying very much about the world we live in. And I would argue, and obviously I would because it's what I do, but I would argue that genre fiction has picked up that baton and run with it. Now, I can't bang the drum for crime fiction as being, the social novel of the moment, while so much of it is still tedious pattern serial killer novels and all that kind of stuff. And the simple fact is there aren't too many of those too many serial killers running about. While there are an awful lot of other sorts of crimes being committed, and if as I do, you believe that the society gets the crime it deserves, and to write about crime is to write about society. I do think that crime fiction is uniquely placed to do that. But more interestingly, why has literary fiction just left the room? Why has it kind of abdicated that responsibility? I mean, I'm talking in huge generalizations here, obviously.
No, but I think a lot of people would recognize it. Literary fiction, and we get back to Will Self, and I don't want to, but it's much more interested in form and experimentalization and demonstrating new mastery of techniques.
Once you get to a certain level, both in society and in sophistication in form and content, you sort of relax a bit. And you start going elsewhere. You think, oh, I've done society now. And then it's the newcomers like genre fiction that start filling in that gap and going, hang on, why is nobody? And so we're all moving up a step, not in any kind of hierarchical, value kind of way. You know what I mean? Just this gap. It's the flow, really.
Yeah,
I think there also was
it's all very well to say, I'm going to write a novel that doesn't use the letter P, or I'm going to write a novel that doesn't have any commas, or doesn't use paragraphs in any conventional way. What's that fucking saying about anything? I mean, seriously.
Doesn't use speech marks. That's my bet noir.
Don't you know that don't you know sometimes just by opening a book and looking at how it's laid out, you go, nope, no, thanks very much.
No, it's absolutely true. I think there was probably a golden era in America, in particular, Saul Bellow, John Updike, when there were very, very intelligent and just quality products coming out that still grapple with the issues confronting society. But they still struggled, and I wonder whether this is part of the story, they still struggled to engage with what you might call the uneducated classes, the unpolished individuals. I read Regeneration recently, Pat Barker's trilogy about the First World War. And I don't know exactly how to read it or understand it, but there was almost an aside at one point about the fact that it was only the officer class who end up in the mental institute where they try and salve the mental traumas they've experienced in the trenches, because they say it's assumed that the officer class, having had a decent education before they end up at the war, have an inner life that's worth salvaging.
Worth saving, yeah.
There's this kind of presumption that the working class that they're just like, they literally are like Wilfred Owen's poem, they are for cattle. And there's that kind of assumption a tiny bit, even in Bellow and Updike. I'm sure they would recoil from it if they were around to confront with it. But that's where genre fiction actually works really well, isn't it? Because genre fiction, or crime fiction in particular, thrives on observing and describing and evoking the activities of the kind of people who do end up committing crimes, which 90% of the time is not actually your Oxford graduates, regardless of what Morse might have you believe. The truth is it tends to be a little bit on the left-hand side of the bell curve. Those kind of people who end up in that struggle.
Well, there is still a huge market for a conventional whodunit. There is still a huge market for your puzzle, but these days most crime novels are about why things happen, rather than if your whole book stands or falls on working out who the killer is, then it's a terrible book. Most people will go, well, it's him or her, and 41 shot.
It can still be gripping, you're right, but I mean,
there has to be something else going on.
What does this happen in TV? You watched a lot more TV crime drama, I would guess, Lucy, than either of us. Maybe not either of us, but certainly than me. What do you think? Does this same sort of thing hold true in TV now?
Yeah, you can get away with less and less, because audiences, whether it's a reading or viewing audience, I think it's getting more and more sophisticated, more and more demanding in a good way. So yes, you can no longer be Agatha Christie, just sort of setting up your plots like clockwork and letting them play out. There has to be, as Mark said, there has to be a why now, and some TV dramas do that much better than others, obviously, because that's the hard bit.
The whole Scandi noir thing has done that quite well, hasn't it? Scandi noir, which has absolutely gripped the British nation, I assume is a worldwide success because they keep pumping it out. It's really interesting because the truth is Scandinavian economies and societies are pretty much the most functional in the world. And it seems like at some point, the Scandinavians cracked and just couldn't bear it any longer and were desperate to reveal themselves as having, you know, more mangled skeletons in their closets than any other nation on earth. But it's
why
all
repression
expressed in terms of like this terrible thing happened in the 1970s and we were beastly, you know. I guess maybe it's Nazi collusion guilt, I don't know.
Well, it's, I mean, I've always been slightly cynical about Scandi noir. Well, only as much as, you know, why is Scandi noir so successful? Because blood looks really good on snow. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate that. But it's so great. I mean, of those Scandi writers, my favourite is an Icelandic writer called Arnaldur Indridason, who's absolutely wonderful, who hasn't had the kind of success that somebody like Joe Nesbo has had. But there's one of his books, a wonderful one of his books, where somebody says something to him like, do you know how many people go missing in Reykjavik every year, detective? 7! You know, and you can, I think I've had one serial killer in history, and yet, you know, there are plenty of writers where there's a new one every week. No, I think what you say about crime drama, though, is interesting, because what you were saying, Lucy, about everybody's much more savvy about these things now. Viewers are hugely savvy. And while I very much admire the kind of David Simon approach of fuck the casual viewer, you know, this is not an easy thing to watch. You can't just tune in and watch episode 7 of this if you haven't watched the others. You've got to.
This is The Wire, right?
This is The Wire and Homicide and all those other. But you also, the other end of that is what's known as the CSI effect that you have on juries and so on, where people watch some of this rubbish, where somebody will walk into a room, you know, somebody will genuinely say, well, of course you can know if he's the killer, because you can get their DNA just from a sample of the air in the room, because it said that on an episode of CSI. So,
David Simon talks about this in the original Homicide Life on the Streets book, which is back in the late 80s. It was already becoming a real problem. And
on that shelf behind me, I do believe. Let me see if I can. This very book here. This very book here, and what a wonderful book it is.
That one, so brilliant. Yeah. As was the TV series. Which is
I haven't seen that, actually. Must admit.
Oh, it's fabulous.
The Wire was probably I mean, it's a good thing to bring up at this point, because I would, from my viewing experience, I would say The Wire was the premier example of a show which genuinely attempted to grapple with reality in all its complexity. I don't think anything has ever been so ambitious, and to be honest, it kind of lost me as a result. I mean, by series 3, I was struggling a little bit to kind of integrate all the different angles that you were getting. I missed the idea that there was a hero, that there was somebody whose voyage through this mess I could take his part. It's really, I mean, that perhaps demonstrates how hard it is.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the other slight elephant in the room when we're discussing these things is if you want fiction, whatever the background of the writer, if that writer wants to accurately reflect what's going on in the world, they will at some point rub up against not simply cultural appropriation, but cultural appropriation is definitely part of what I'm talking about. Which for me, quite simply, means the death of fiction, right? Yeah. I mean, there's not much I agree with Lionel Shriver about, but an awful lot of that notorious speech she made, I did find myself going, yep, I really can't disagree with a word of this, because on the one hand, if as a straight white middle-aged man, I deliver a book that is full of characters from completely different ethnicities and completely different sexualities, I understand that in this day and age, those things need to be run by my publisher past kind of sensitivity gurus or whatever their job description is. But at the same time, if all I can write about is white, middle-aged, straight men, these books are going to be dull as ditch water. And then I'm also going to be accused of not. That's not the London I'm writing about. It's
exactly right. I mean, that's a really good example, because the book I asked you before this, what were you most proud of in the last few ones you've written? And I read it, of course, which was it's called Love Like Blood, right? And that's about honor killings, I guess, primarily. Yeah. And that would be a perfect example of that, I guess. I mean, I did as I was reading it, I was kind of going, I was kind of internally whistling, through my teeth, thinking, whoa, he went there.
Well, that book was probably 6 years ago now, and I wonder whether I would have it published quite so easily, whether my publisher might take me out for a long lunch at some point and go, are you sure?
Did that go through a sensitivity reader?
No.
Talk amongst yourselves for 1 minute.
Not in any official way, Lucy. I mean, but I basically made sure it was read at a very early stage by Muslim and Sikh readers at my publisher. I wanted them to read it, and obviously they were going to come back to me with stupid inaccuracies. So you've got that.
The false notes, I can see.
Yeah, you've got that.
One thing that I noticed, Mark, because I listen to all my books now, as I say, on Audible, and you read most of it, but there were a couple of characters that were voiced by people who were genuinely of that ethnicity, but not all of them. You did a few people who were, I guess, Indian or Pakistani, and there was an Irishman as well.
No, I didn't.
Oh, it wasn't you? Okay.
No, I didn't. And that's, I mean, that's another case in point, because I narrate all my own audiobooks, but some of the books, it's quite clear where you go, I can't do that. Yes, I can do the Geordie character, and I can do the Mancunian guy, and I can attempt a Scottish accent, but suddenly I can't be doing Indian accents.
But it's funny, you sort of did you do the female cops, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Where what line, which one you're presumed to have crossed or not crossed.
Well, there may come a point when I can't do that. But
here's the thing. I mean, I've got a couple of friends who are at the criminal bar, so I have some idea. Over the last 15 years, I talk to them frequently about what cases are coming up and what they're dealing with most of the time. And my perception is it's not reflected at all certainly in the crime dramas that dominate on TV, or especially the ones that present themselves as gritty realism. Obviously, we still have room for Father Brown, and I love all that. But it's not reflected. It's not truthful. A lot of the murders he deals with are like kids coked up and running into a party with a machete, really horrific. And I feel like maybe society should have a chance to engage with that reality through fiction, but nobody seems to want to go there. And I wonder whether it is fear of transgressing and stepping on toes and creating more friction. And I don't know whether there is, some people would say, I remain agnostic on this. Some people would say that there are certain dispositions which dominate, certainly at the BBC, which have a certain kind of narrative, and they like to see their drama support that narrative, and certain things would be counter to that narrative. I would assume that wouldn't compromise your work, Mark, for instance.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the thing about crime drama generally, which is why it's so popular, is that it's an enormous umbrella. I mean, just enormous. You walk into, it's not quite the same in this country, but in the US, if you walk into a mystery bookstore, of which there are hundreds, a huge network of them, then you just see the range of it. You see cat mysteries, cooking mysteries, cat and cooking mysteries, mysteries featuring specific breeds of dog mysteries, real estate mysteries. I mean, it's baffling. Mysteries where between each chapter there's a knitting pattern or a recipe, there's everything. Yeah. But even when you see, on British crime drama, for example, you've got Midsummer Murders, you've got The Coziest of the Cozy, or you've got Death in Paradise, which is I'm gathering all my suspects together to tell them how I've solved the case. But you've also got, dark as burnt toast, noirish stuff as well, or serial. It's a massive umbrella, and some people want, and it's been reflected, I think, certainly in lockdown, we've seen a lot of this. Some people just want something that is pure escapism. They just want something where all the loose ends are tied up at the end and the status quo is restored and the bad people get what's coming to them. Some people want something a bit deeper and something that is saying a little bit more. But
it seems to be go on, Lucy. Yeah, sorry.
Individuals can want all those things at different times. Under lockdown, you think you're going to learn the piano like you think you're going to watch The Wire. I'm not. I'm going to sit back and watch repeats of Midsummer Murders. It just depends what kind of bandwidth you've got available.
Do you have a favorite fictional detective series, or 3 or 4?
Oh,
this is Lucy.
Okay.
You will have, Mark, I'm sure.
I read I don't know. Well, I know partly why, but I read a lot of for what I think of as gory stuff, and probably proper fans would laugh in my face. Gory stuff, I tend to read just American people, because if we're talking about reality, I find if it's gory and British, it's too much for me. It's too slow. I think I'm going to step outside the door and get murdered, because what's the point of reading a book if you're not going to get involved? And I get involved, and I think I'm going to be killed. So American and horror, gory, proper, stabby serial killers. If it's British, I tend to stick to women and very psychological stuff, like Louise Candlish and Jane Casey and Susie Steiner, Erin Kelly, because I want the psychology more than I want and I also want to. I was going to go back to our earlier discussion, which I'm not even sure was recorded, but it's a bit like I want the kite mark of it being written by a woman, to know that I can relax and know I'm not going to be just presented with something.
Yeah, the girls being
really
knifed for your delectation. Yeah.
A bit like, if I were going to watch porn, I'd much prefer to know it was coming from a female maid or an OnlyFans account where the money's going straight to her. Some kind of imprimatur that I can relax into. Sorry, where were we?
Well, my wife reads quite a lot of detective fiction, but all her stuff is repeat detective. It's quite hard for anyone to break in, and it seems to me quite obvious, and she hasn't denied it, that the key is an enticing geographical location, which would make a suitable pilgrimage for a summer holiday. Her number one is Donna Leone.
Donna Leone. I knew you.
Yeah.
Said that. I said that was Donna Leone.
Yeah, and she does love Venice anyway. She already did, but I mean,
Andrea Camilleri.
Yeah, I believe so. There's quite a lot of we went to Sicily just like for 4 days before they reintroduced quarantine in October to go and see Montalbano, and we went on a brief trail. And I read one of those Montalbanos, and funnily enough, that come back to what you were saying earlier, which was like it had to be about a reason. It wasn't about the psychology of the killer. Actually, that was about a degree of, I suppose, historical differences that had emerged geographically on Sicily to the Second World War. That's like a real banker. It seems if I was going to do one now, I think I would probably set it in a village in the south of France, which had divided very viscerally over the Vichy sort of France, and had never healed. That would be the stuff to do. But it's almost like when you think of, here's my detective, where am I going to put him, and what's the recipe book look like? They have to love the local cuisine. Even Rankin has, who's based in Edinburgh, where there is no local cuisine, but he has like the Oxford bar and a favourite malt. It's like you really got to anchor. But I don't see. I might be mistaken, and you might go, well, what about X? But I don't see any other genre really, let alone literary genre, fulfilling that. The returning character with a sense of place and something that fills the senses a little bit, the way that cuisine does, I guess.
Well, somebody much smarter than me once said either everything is a genre or nothing is. And I think you have to accept that literary fiction is its own genre. It is a genre every bit as much as sci-fi or romance, because you can divide it up into its subgenres and all that sort of stuff. The problem is when these things are measured against each other, it's always ludicrous. Someone will take some terrible potboiler serial killer garbage and say, are you telling me this is as good as Ian McEwan? Well, no, of course it freaking isn't. Nobody's saying it is. But you take some up itself literary novel that doesn't use punctuation properly and stick it up against Elmore Leonard, and then sorry, I know where my money is. It really sounds facile, but a good book is a good book and a bad book is a bad book.
Yeah, Oscar Wilde, you got it right. So, okay, let me ask you, Lucy, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but you can take a moment to think about it because, we've got the power of editing to make you look instantaneous.
Well, yeah, it'll look like that.
2 or 3 books or TV series or films that have actually illuminated the state of the nation for you, or indeed another nation. I guess we are all at least as fascinated with America as we are with ourselves. I would give you one example. I do remember, even though it was very much also one of those books that everyone had on the tube, Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe, that was about 1987, I think. Like, I just felt like it was threw open a window and you were just like standing on a, you were standing on a terrace, just like looking at like a 3D map of New York and everything that was interconnecting on it. It was an extraordinary achievement. I don't think I've read a book like that for quite some time that's opened up. I think to some extent Franson's The Corrections had a little bit of that. It was a much narrower focus. It was a single family, but it felt like it opened up like what was happening in family dynamics. But it's very hard to find books like that kind of just illuminate or paint a panorama. Can you think of one, Lucy? Is there anything like that that's...
I can't think of a book just at the moment, but when you said, but for television, I think it was I May Destroy You with Michaela Cole, which was the product of her, Michaela Cole's, one woman's vision. You know, she wrote it, she starred in it. I think did she direct it? But she was all over it, and it was her thing. And she was a young black woman, and it was about lots else. But the driving force was a date rape, a drug rehypnol kind of sexual assault, and it showed me exactly the London I know.
I have to say, other date rape drugs are available at this point.
No, you don't, Simon. Actually, no, you don't. Okay. But from a 90-degree angle of someone a good 15 years younger than me and black and living a much more glamorous, exciting, energetic life, and it was phenomenal. But again, it was so true, so relatable in all the important ways of her, as women were all vulnerable in this way. If you're young, you would have related to her in all that way. It was absolutely genius, and it blew my mind and made
that's called I May Destroy You.
I May Destroy You. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think, Mark? Have you got anything of that?
It would all be crimey. It's always crimey with me.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Bonfire of the Vanities starts with a crime, doesn't it? Or even though it's only a fairly minor one, it's deserting the scene of an accident. But that's what
early John Grisham taking you through the American legal system is incredible as well. I remember finding that really striking. That he's, how he kept your interest while he was explaining.
I mean, crime. The Godfather. I mean, if you actually read, as I actually read the book, the film is arguably the greatest film ever made as well. So it's not like the film, kind of cheapened it, but as a book which started it. That is a really powerful, illuminating examination of a kind of subterranean dimension of American public life, right?
Well, not just illuminating. I mean, I think it was everybody at the time went, what? This stuff exists? No, it really was. It really was an incredibly powerful book. And of course, what any book like that does is spawn a whole series of inferior imitations. And the awful thing, the sort of books you're talking about, Lucy, that you don't want to read, where chapter 13, here comes victim 48, and the killer must kill another woman when the moon is full, and all that.
Played in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. The book that started all that, arguably, or the two books that started all that, two wonderful thrillers by Thomas Harris called Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, which are wonderful. I mean, wonderful, wonderful books and great thrillers that don't just use victims as plot devices and are about all sorts of stuff and, focus on this woman and her journey through the FBI and all that sort of stuff. But inevitably, every month there's 10 more of them. And
funny enough, we watched it quite recently, Silence of the Lambs, because my son had become old enough to cope with it, we thought. Turned out, maybe. But it was really interesting how even then in that film, and that was, 25, maybe 30 years ago,
30,
they were at some pains to emphasize that trans people, he's not a classic. This is not it was almost like, I thought it was almost weird. It was like that kind of clause that gets inserted quite often now if you watch a TV grand drama.
It's in the original book, which is even earlier. This tree will be frightful, he says.
But it's the mark of Raymond Chandler had this wonderful thing where he would say, if I'm ever stuck for where the plot is going to go and I don't know what's going to happen next, I'll just have somebody walk through the door with a gun.
Yeah.
And
and famously, he didn't always bother to tie up what happened to him.
No, there's the famous story about when he gets a call from John Huston when they're doing is it The Big Sleep?
Yes, The Big Sleep.
They call Chandler up and go, listen, we're a bit lost, Ray. you know, who did kill the chauffeur? And Chandler.
Yeah, don't know.
Anyone's guess. Anyone's guess.
One of the most wonderful things, and it's still up on YouTube, is you can hear, it's only audio for obvious reasons, there's a conversation between Raymond Chandler and Ian Fleming, which is absolute. I urge you to listen to it. And it's the sort of thing, somebody needs to write this drama the day these two met.
Yeah.
Fleming Chandler. Conversation, because it's slightly sad because Chandler is pissed and a little bit past his best. And why this should surprise me, because Fleming is unutterably posh. I mean, unutterably posh. Yeah. But it's so rare. So rare. Let's talk about Philip Marlowe, and then Chandler's, well, you know, bizarre conversation. But
there's something about Chandler's stuff, and I don't know whether this is how to attach this entirely to my central thesis, but The Big Sleep in particular is like druggy. And I don't mean people are on drugs, but the experience of reading it's slightly hallucinatory. You get lost in a tangled tropical swamp. It's like going out on a patrol in Vietnam or something, one of those movies where you don't know what's dangerous anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's not like most crime dramas that I've read in recent years are pretty, that word gritty, you know, is like the key thing. And it's like, he saw this, he went through the files, he went to the pub, he thought about it, the pieces sort of click into place, it reminded him of something, made a call, that kind of stuff. Marlowe, he seems to be almost tripping at times. Do you know what I mean? The struggle he is having to make any sense of the world that's around him. Well, I don't know whether that was authentically the Californian experience in that time, but it might.
I think it may have been, but I think even better than, I mean, I think a lot of writers from that era have that same thing. You know, Ross MacDonald has a similar thing. But for me, the best one of all is Dashiell Hammett, who what he does so brilliantly is he doesn't do that thing which Stephen King talks about a lot and Elmore Leonard talks about a lot, doing the reader's job for them, which is telling them kind of what everybody's thinking and what everybody's wearing and you know, leaves the reader's imagination with nowhere to go. So you have an iconic character like Sam Spade, who only appeared in one novel, Maltese Falcon.
Wow, it's only one novel. Wow, they made more than one film, right?
Of the Maltese Falcon, they made about 4 films. Yeah.
No, but of Sam Spade, was that the only story?
No, that's the only novel he appears in. Wow. There were a couple of short stories, but he's in one novel. But the reason he's so iconic is he is the mystery in that book. You know, the actual Maltese Falcon is the greatest MacGuffin in the history of, you know, nobody cares about the bloody Falcon. The mystery is, who is this guy? And why is he doing the things he's doing? And is he the hero, or is he as bad as all? Because you never know what's inside his head. And
there's one of my absolute favourite scenes, genuinely the top 10 of all American cinema, is Sidney Greenstreet meeting Sam Spade, the fat man. And he offers him a drink. He offers Spade a drink, and Spade accepts. And he says, "Good. I like a man who'll take a drink. Never trust a man who doesn't drink. He doesn't trust himself." It's like one of those, again, thunderbolt kind of insights the first time I heard it. But like what you've just said, because it means that Spade does trust himself, but because he has nothing to reveal. He has nothing that he's afraid of revealing, because he's a cipher.
But one of the things that I've always found really interesting is that kind of wonderful dialogue, you know, that sort of fiery, quick, flashy dialogues is exactly the same with very different sorts of language as what was happening in this country at the same time with Noel Coward. It absolutely is. You know, you chuck in a
perfect
doors and a tennis racket. And
Blithe Spirit with Sam Spade.
That's right.
That's superb. That's from your days of improv. Funny enough, I mean, I wanted to say that. I don't know whether you know this, Lucy, but Mark and I used to know each other on the stand-up circuit years ago. I mean, I guess it's 20 years since you did it, almost.
25, yeah.
Yeah. But I noticed in that Live Like Blood thing, there were a couple of, Love Like Blood, there were a couple of moments where it almost felt like you were remembering the comedian heckler dynamic, you know, where there are those moments where people are winding each other up and there's a little bit of racist banter, which it turns out is staged in order to, I don't want to, you know, I think that's fairly early on. You find out that's a spoiler, don't you? So if anyone were to read it, but I want to get Lucy back in here now because I'm still learning my host chops to keep it balanced, but I am intrigued. This is my thing to say to both of you. I think stand-up bears some responsibility here as well. I think stand-up comedians very often offer a sanitized and safe version of reality with such kind of bumptious enthusiasm that the audience go along with it, and it can also be guilty of distorting reality or presenting a very dated idea, because I think our prejudices, I'm not saying prejudices will ever be eliminated, but what's interesting I find about them is that they're very slow to catch up with even with the sort of crude statistics on which they're normally based. If you have a prejudice against pit bulls, that's not totally unreasonable, right? There are a lot of pit bulls implicated in serious crime, but it's that kind of thing doesn't catch up very quickly, and stand-up can be extraordinary. That's where I sort of got the first sense of it. The degree to which, if you're a comedian, if you're a compere hosting a comedy club, it's so easy to ask if there are any comedians and any Americans in the audience, and then go, of course there aren't, because they would all be whooping by now. Yeah. And you go, Americans haven't whooped like that for a long time. They are a broken people. They are as broken as Britain is now. They are crushed. They are no longer this kind of ebullient, reality denying horde of trust fund, garish coloured Hawaiian shirt wearing,
You're writing an entire stand-up routine here. I don't know whether you're making one. But the next time you're comparing a gig, it's exact. You've got 5 minutes, and there's a couple
they'll
of
all be
people trying to whoop, with some genetic, some memory deep in them that need. Oh, I know I can't do it. And off you go. You've got 10 minutes there.
What do you think, Lucy? Do you ever go and see stand-up?
No, I did do it a bit at university and things, but
what did it or went to it?
No, did it?
Performed. Wow. Go on, give us one of your routines. Go on.
Absolutely not. No. But I always felt very sorry. There was a spate quite a few years ago now, but it was around the time, because the only one I remember, it's not the ideal example, but the only one I remember, there was a spate of complaints about stand-up comedians saying stuff. And one of them, remember, was Billy Connolly, when the man was it Ken somebody big, was about to be beheaded.
Yes.
It's an awful story.
Oh God. Yeah.
And Billy Connolly got into trouble by saying in one of his sets in a live show, "Oh, don't you wish they'd just get on with it?" And he got a reasonable, and of course he was hammered for that. But it's attacking. I always think it's attacking things at the wrong end, because you cannot judge someone who is A, doing a live show, or B, even probably doing live any kind of comedy set, to get it right every time, to adjust minutely, and also they have to deal in broad brush strokes quite a lot, unless
what he was dealing with there, which is totally right, and he should deal with it. He was dealing with our terrible internal monologues, our interior, thoughts.
This is why it wasn't such a good example, because I always thought actually he got that wrong. It wasn't actually what people were thinking.
No, of course, but it's a risk.
The problem with the joke, but he got hammered for simply saying.
That kind of joke is always a risk, and it's one reason. It's not a hill I'll die on, but I do think Michael McIntyre is underestimated to some extent.
Yeah.
And regarded as just purveyor of blandness and beige. Almost all his stuff is of that kind, but he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't say that, but it's almost always about what you're thinking, what you're really thinking in any given situation, your neuroses and anxieties and paranoias. And it is risky, because we don't always know that we always think the same things. That wonderful line from Shadowlands, the C.S. Lewis film, where C.S. Lewis is told by one of his students, and remembers it, that we read to know that we are not alone, because it's so hard to know that from the way that the people you're surrounded with socially. It's so very hard to be sure that they might be sharing even 1/10 of your internal torment, even in normal situations.
This is why Victoria Wood was so loved and so popular, was that she managed, possibly uniquely in history, she was the only one who's ever managed to nail so many of our internal monologue pieces and our worries and our prejudices. But without making them worse and without indulging them, just recognizing, just giving them a humorous twist and going and a look in your eye, really.
The tendency to trivialize. Go on, Mark. Yeah.
The key difference, of course, is that you say Michael McIntyre not knocking Michael McIntyre at all, but of course what he is doing is exactly what you were talking about. It's essentially a longer form version of Don't You Just Hate It When the draw's always full of rubbish or da-da. But the point is he can know if he's on the right wavelength, because of course he does it one night and he doesn't get a laugh, and he, Don't You Just Hate It When nothing. Yeah. Oh, you don't? Okay, well I'll leave that one. That's the difference between.
In this respect, he really is. He's just like Hitler in that.
But but you know what I mean. Once something is put down in print, it is there, and it is there, and it is always there. Whereas a stand-up can change a routine from one night to the next.
Chris Rock said it's like fail fast. Just constantly testing stuff out, and if it fails 3 times, it's gone. Yeah.
I do love the moments when comedy absolutely turns. I mean, I can remember when I started doing it in the mid to late 80s. Everything was incredibly right on. I mean, very, very right on. I remember I was in a double act at the time, and we got booed one night at some club for saying girlfriend. I've never forgotten that. I'm thinking, well, I haven't said anything. I've just said I've got a girlfriend. Ooh. And things were very right on. And it stayed that way until one night, and I was there when Jerry Sadowitz walked on stage, and when Nelson Mandela, what a cunt. and it was this moment of everybody looking around going, what the fuck just happened?
He had a punchline. Do you remember it?
About lending him a $5 or something?
Yeah, you lend some blokes a $5, you never see them again. Yeah.
The fact that he opened with that, and the audience just kind of went, holy crap. But that was kind of an amazing moment.
I wonder whether we're ready for that.
Ourselves recalibrated,
Can you imagine, here's an idea, can you imagine a film like Dirty Harry being made now? As a response to the urban squalor, which is surely not improved in San Francisco since it was made.
No, I don't think I can. Certainly not in terms of the way police in America, quite rightly, are being viewed at the moment, whether as an institution, those kind of maverick cops running around going, make my day and all that sort of stuff they're not the issue. That would seem like you're addressing the wrong issue completely.
But they have moved. They still exist, don't they? They're just in like skin tight lycra now. Marvel Cinematic Universe is more fascist than Dirty Harry ever was, isn't he?
Yeah. But I mean, that is a thing, isn't it? It's become a thing now to go, can you imagine that book being published now, that TV show being made now, that you watch old episodes of sitcoms and go, oh blimey, couldn't whatever. I mean, and I think that's a good thing. I generally think that's a good thing, that at least we're having those conversations and going, that you wouldn't do that now. Whether those things should therefore be erased from history is a different.
No, that's fair. It's another question, because there were other things that we could make now which you couldn't imagine being made in 1971, certainly, which would have had you can't imagine a film being made with a lesbian lead in 1971. I don't think, can you? And that would, I'm not thinking of anything in particular, but that would be perfectly feasible now, I would imagine. Well, it seems to be Line of Duty seems to be going with that, this series. Have you watched the first one? Lucy, your face is becoming immobile. I've lost Lucy. It was the first time I mentioned Dirty Harry. She was like, okay, I'm just going to let him get this out.
You can find what somebody's saying on Zoom unutterably dull and tedious. And then when that's pointed out, you just go, oh no, I think I froze for a minute.
I have done that. I basically have a problem. It's very useful.
Well, he's a great person on which to end this. I've been a fantastic, fascinating, very worthwhile, invigorating conversation. Mark, Lucy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm only sorry, Lucy, you weren't able to enjoy your lamb today, but I hope, Mark, give us a word about the lamb.
Oh, the lamb was extraordinary. Oh my God, Lucy, you're in for such a treat. The lamb was extraordinary, that tiramisu, and it's a big old portion of tiramisu.
It is, isn't it? That's what struck me. I couldn't believe how good it was and how big it was. Those are normally to pick one, but no. I am so grateful to HomeJames and Il Portico for sponsoring these very worthwhile conversations. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you again, Mark. Lovely to meet you, Lucy.
Lovely to meet you, Lucy.
I hope we can do this again on the premises in due course. And I'll tweak the subject matter because, to be honest, it's always just, it's the first the first step down a path that meanders where it goes. Thank you very much indeed. Stay safe for these last few crucial hours of lockdown. and see you out there in the real world. Take care. Bye.